Hi there, this is a revision video looking at the topic of aerobic and anaerobic exercise for GCSE, relating to the AQA specification. So firstly, let's look at aerobic exercise. When we talk about aerobic, we're talking about it being in the presence of oxygen, and that's what you will see typically written on exam mark schemes. We also need to work out and remember the equation. So it's important to know that some glucose will be used, but oxygen is our main energy source, i.e. we're working aerobically, which sounds like air, using oxygen, leading to energy being created or used and waste products of carbon dioxide and water. And you'll see with an exam answer in a minute how that may be relevant, why it might be needed with regards to exam questions. When we're working aerobically, it's typically at a moderate intensity with a long duration. So we need to be working typically for over 20 minutes if we're going to get cardiovascular benefits. The aerobic training zone, so we need to be working above the aerobic training threshold, which is 60%, and working between 60 and 80% of our maximum heart rate. If we now look at anaerobic exercise, in this case, we're looking at it being in the absence of oxygen. We're working too intensely for oxygen to be readily available to continue to supply the energy that's needed for exercise. So in this case, we are working and using glucose, leading to energy, and the big waste product on this occasion is lactic acid. Because we're working intensely, like in a 100-meter sprint, we're going to be working at a high intensity over a short duration. We need to be working above the anaerobic training threshold, which is 80%. So we're working between 80 and 90% of our maximum heart rate. Just to reiterate before we look at some questions, when you are giving examples for aerobic and anaerobic exercise, make sure that you are referring to obvious examples. You could justify that a winger in football will be working anaerobically when sprinting for the ball, but keep it simple. Just select a 100-meter sprinter. You don't have to make things any harder than it needs to be. So some exam questions then. Here you can see that we are needing to define. So that's assessment outcome 1, just give me the information, and it's anaerobic exercise. The AO2 context has already been provided, so it must come from athletics. So we're looking at anaerobic exercise here. So this would be exercise in the absence of oxygen. And an example, let's keep it nice and simple, will be something like a 100-meter sprinter. Often in mark schemes, it'll be slightly more generic. It won't give you specific examples, but you put 100-meter sprint, that will be more than enough to get the answer. And in many cases, that's the preference, particularly if they've not already given you the AO2. Here you can see that we've got to, again, define aerobic exercise, and it's also, again, given as the AO2 context. So that AO2 must come from athletics. So we've got to pick an event that would be readily available. Aerobic, I'm going to circle it just to make sure it's in the forefront of my mind. So therefore, this is exercise in the presence of oxygen. And an example would be something like a marathon runner. Here they've mentioned long distance, except any distance from 800 meters and above. A marathon runner clearly is the obvious example. So we are guaranteeing the mark. Here, I did mention earlier that you need to learn the definitions for both. This is referring to aerobic exercise. So identify, there's boxing the keyword, just tell me the information. And we know that we need to just provide it because it's given us the spaces to include it. 2, but then again, we know that there's 2 marks available. And we're looking here at waste products when working aerobically. Athletics is once again given as the AO2. Doesn't really matter too much here because we won't have to specifically relate it to it, but we know that the context is given if we did want to apply it. So because we're looking at aerobic, let's always start by putting the equation down. So we have got glucose plus oxygen leads to energy plus carbon dioxide plus water. So therefore, straight away, we know the answers provided, and there's one of the reasons why you must learn the definition. Water, typically through loss of sweat, carbon dioxide through expiration. Here, slightly trickier question to finish with. We've got the word discuss. That's now requiring more from us. That means we've got to look at both sides of the argument. Weight training is the closest to methods of training. That's the next layer down. And it specifies both aerobic and anaerobic. So there's our discussion point. Is weight training an aerobic or is it an anaerobic activity? Technically, it could be either, and that's what we would have to do within this mark scheme. So if we were working anaerobically, we would be working at a high intensity. Often there will be a high weight with a longer recovery period. We'll be working anaerobically, so therefore we've got glycogen as our main energy source. So we're going to be using glycogen stores, and we also know that lactic acid will be produced. So it can be anaerobically, but equally it could be aerobic. So if it's an aerobic activity, in this case, we are using a moderate intensity. Sometimes you'll see it written as lower. In this case, we're going to be using oxygen as our main energy source because there's longer periods of exercise. And there's going to be not much recovery or rest period because that's then going to replicate both cardiovascular and muscular endurance as our training method. So oxygen is available. So we would have to discuss whether weight training is aerobic or anaerobic, and it could be either. So therefore we would need to justify, if you like, that yes, it is anaerobic, but also it by every chance could be an aerobic activity, depending on how we structure the training session. So when we're looking at this topic, try to make sure that you are able to define both aerobic and anaerobic exercise. You must know the equation, and we've got one question that we've looked at that reinforces why. Always give obvious examples. Don't make life any harder than it needs to be. And you need to be able to justify the intensity with regards to the training threshold being met, linking that to percentage of maximum heart rate.